Billy couldn't believe it. He had traveled to his hometown to visit the grave of a loved one, but instead, he found something he had never expected. He had stumbled upon a tombstone with his old photo and his name. How was that possible? He was alive and kicking. At first he thought it was a practical joke, but the tombstone seemed too real to be. Billy couldn't understand how and why he had gotten there, but he would soon discover the surprising truth. Billy was left with a million questions, and there was only one way he could think of to find out what was going on here. But this was something he swore he would never do again. He hesitated for a long time, but he knew he needed answers. Billy takes his phone out of his pocket and dials the number. It only rang a couple of times until he picked up the phone. "You have a lot to explain." But why was there a headstone with Billy's name and photo on it in this cemetery? Who was responsible? And who did Billy call to get his answers? There was a reason Billy hadn't been home in over a decade. Ever since he was a child, he had hated his hometown with a passion. Shortly after turning 18 years, he left and never thought twice about returning. But recently, something happened that made Billy decide to come back for the last time. Billy had just received the unexpected news that his father had passed away 3 years ago. He hadn't kept in touch with his family, but he never thought he'd find out about his father's death so late. Billy's family still lived in town, but none of them spoke to each other. When he was a child, his family had made his life miserable. To protect himself, Billy stopped talking to all of them, even during holidays and other special occasions. Only 2 people in his family had bothered to approach him. Billy's parents had made some efforts to keep in touch, but it was too late for him. He was no longer interested in maintaining those relationships. He wanted to focus on a healthier future with people who cared about him. But then, he learned of his father's death in the strangest way. Without realizing it, Billy had left his father as an emergency contact in some old files and documents. When Billy was in a car accident and had to be taken to the hospital, the center called his father to notify him that Billy was admitted for treatment. That's how they learned of the old man's death. But how had he died? Although Billy wasn't very close to his parents, he was surprised by the news. No one else in the family had told him about his father. Billy felt he needed to close that chapter for good. And the best way to do that was to say goodbye. So he started planning a trip back home. He had no idea that it would change his life forever. Billy looked up the information in the newspaper and found out where his father was buried. She planned to go to the grave, say goodbye to him, and go home. He had no doubt that he would see his family. I knew it wouldn't be a good idea, but he also had to face other challenges before leaving. Billy had crossed the country after moving. To get to his hometown and his father's grave, he would have to drive for almost an entire day. It wouldn't be an easy trip, but Billy thought it would be best to go alone. His wife had other ideas. Billy's wife wanted to keep him company during his trip. She didn't know much about her past, and her children even less. But when Billy explained that he needed to do it alone, she relented and accepted his decision. Even so, she couldn't stay away completely when Billy was suffering. I had to do something. Without intruding, Billy's wife did her best to make the process as easy as possible. It helped him plan the best routes to drive and what clothes to wear. Billy was clearly overwhelmed by the situation, but it wasn't long before the time came to leave. He felt ready. Almost. Billy's hometown was in a historic area of the country where there were many small cemeteries. It was common for old families to have their own cemeteries. Luckily, he had been able to find out exactly where his father had been buried. When he arrived and started to take a look, the place surprised him. Unlike the oldest cemeteries in the city, this cemetery was quiet and relatively new. It was located next to a forest on the outskirts of the city. It was still a little scary, but Billy was glad that his father had such a beautiful resting place. Only one thing seemed strange to him. Billy went through the ranks and searched through the names. Some of them sounded familiar to him. He wondered why he knew so many surnames when he had been out of town for more than 10 years. And he stopped to read the names and dates as well. I couldn't believe my eyes. An icy chill came over him. Billy realized that many of the graves belonged to people he knew. There were more than a few of his former classmates buried here. The number of acquaintances and friends in the cemetery made him uneasy. Everyone should be more or less his age. Would some kind of accident have occurred? There had never been. Billy paused and began to do the math to see how old they were when they died. He felt so disconnected from his past. Some of the graves did not have the years clearly written where he could see them, but he did what he could to calculate the age of the tombstones, and he had not yet found his father's grave. Billy was arriving at the last graves in the cemetery. He looked at the sign again, wondering if he had been wrong somehow. Had he taken the wrong grave? He even began to think that maybe the hospital had mistaken him for someone else. But there was still half a row of tombstones to be checked. He continued to worry about whether he could trust the hospital until he reached the last set of tombstones and saw his last name in the distance. When Billy read the engraving of the weathered stone in front of him, he was startled. It was not his father's grave at all. Instead of his father's information, Billy was looking at his own photo, name, and date of birth. He read it several times, convinced that his own mind was playing tricks on him. But the numbers and letters remained the same. It was his grave. Billy looked around the cemetery and expected to hear someone start laughing at any moment. It had to be a joke in bad taste. He imagined that some old friend or relative had planned this to torment him, as a way of punishing him for not keeping in touch. However, he couldn't help but wonder why they had waited so many years to laugh at him. When Billy calmed down enough to collect his thoughts, he realized that this was too elaborate and expensive to be a joke. It was evident that the tombstone had been there for a long time, and there was no one else around to see it during his visit to the cemetery. There had to be a simple explanation. Billy stared at his tombstone, contemplating how he was going to find out the truth about the situation. He needed answers, and finally accepted that there was only one way to get them. Billy had planned to be in town for only a short trip, but realized he needed to stay if he wanted to unravel this unusual mystery. Billy knew he had to stay, but he didn't feel like going to his parents' house yet. He needed to clear his mind before facing his mother and the rest of his family. They hadn't spoken to each other for so long that he had no idea how she would react when she saw him. Then it dawned on him. What if no one had contacted him for so long because everyone thought he was dead? He looked at the flowers on his grave. Someone must have put them there recently. Suddenly, a feeling of sadness came over him. He felt it for his mother. She had lost her husband and believed that her son, too. He was still angry at her for the things that had happened when he was little, but deep down in his heart, he knew he had to make things right. He decided to contact her tomorrow. First, I needed a good night's sleep after such a strange day. He booked a night at the first motel he found, ordered pizza, and showered. As he ate, he thought about the events of that day. He still couldn't believe what he had seen in the cemetery. How was it possible that so many people he knew were buried there? What had happened to them? He remembered most of the names he saw. They were all people he had gotten along with when he was still living here. Some he even called friends. I hadn't spoken to them in years, and now they were all gone. It didn't make any sense to Billy. I felt like I needed a good night's sleep to process everything I'd seen that day, but no matter what I tried, I just couldn't fall asleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he went back to the cemetery. The mystery of it all kept him awake for hours, and he knew he had to solve it. It was clear that he wasn't going to fall asleep anyway, and he realized that there were better ways to pass the time than lying in bed, doing nothing. I had so many questions that I desperately wanted to find an answer to. He still didn't understand how and why his own tombstone had ended up there, nor had he found his father's grave. And he also didn't understand how all his friends and acquaintances had ended up there. He felt that he was missing something, and he needed to solve the enigma. While in the city, I had to find out what had happened to everyone. The only plausible explanation he could think of was that there had been a terrible accident. But the more he thought about it, the less sense his theory made. You see, he hadn't followed the local news in his city much, but if there had been such a big accident that it had cost so many lives, he would certainly have been on the national or at least regional news, right? But Billy didn't remember seeing or hearing anything like it. He decided to search the internet, but, to his frustration, he found nothing. No matter what he typed or what website he visited, he couldn't find a single article about an accident or anything else that might have happened to his old friends. This didn't make any sense. Billy began to feel very restless. I didn't understand what was happening. What else could have happened to them? Or had someone covered it up? I no longer knew what to think or feel, but one thing was for sure. I didn't want to stay here longer than necessary. The sooner he solved this mystery, the sooner he could return home. He tried to think of a plan, but a sense of guilt came over him. He had never kept in touch with all those people he used to care about. He regretted not having put more effort into maintaining relations. And now, it was too late. Or so I thought. Suddenly, Billy is pulled out of his thoughts by a vibrating noise. It was his phone. He had received a text message. The only person he could think of who would text him in the middle of the night was his wife. For a second, he really worried. Had something happened at home? But as he looked at his phone screen, his face paled. The text message I had received was from an unknown number, and I couldn't believe what it said. His heart pounded in his chest as he thought about what he should do next. He was terrified. "Have you missed us? Come to the cemetery. We are waiting for you." His hands trembled as he read the message over and over again. This couldn't be real. What was going on? He thought he was hallucinating, but no matter how many times he checked his phone, the message was still there. I knew what I had to do. He got into his car and drove to the cemetery, trembling with fear. Who had sent that message? He didn't believe in ghosts, but he couldn't think of any logical explanation for what had just happened. He sat in the car for a while, afraid to get out. But after taking a few deep breaths, he finally mustered up the courage he needed to face whatever was waiting for him. It was dark, and the only sources of light were some candles lit in some graves. Billy didn't like darkness anyway, but this was the next level. He had to be strong and find out who had sent him that message. But what if it was a trap? What if someone had hurt his friends and was now waiting for him? He decided that he owed it to his friends to find out what had happened to them. It was the last thing I could do for them. So he bravely stepped into the darkness, not knowing what to expect. But he soon began to deeply regret his decision. Suddenly, he heard noises around him. At first, he assumed that it was some animal that was sneaking through the leaves and the grass. But the noises were getting louder and louder and seemed to be getting closer to him. Billy wanted to run away and never come back, but he knew he would regret not going through with his plan to uncover the truth. However, what he saw next had a complete impact on him. It was impossible. He froze and couldn't believe his eyes. The night before, her own headstone had been the last in line. But now, Another tombstone was right next to him, and when he saw whose name it was, he almost screamed. His father's name and photo were on it. How could that be? I was 100% sure that this hadn't been there the night before. He looked around, scared to death. Who had put this here? While he was there, he saw something moving behind the tombstones, a few rows in front of him. Because of the darkness, he couldn't really see what it was, but it was definitely coming towards him. As much as Billy wanted to solve the mystery, this was much more than he could handle. He prepared himself and prepared to run for his life. The shadow was getting closer and closer to Billy, and he wanted to run, but he was so scared he couldn't move. He was paralyzed with fear. All I could do was close my eyes and scream, and he screamed louder than ever. He had prepared for the impact, but nothing happened. Suddenly, he heard something he didn't expect. When he opened his eyes, he needed a second to realize what was happening. And when he did, he realized that he had never really been in danger. Billy saw that he was surrounded by his old friends, classmates, and acquaintances. Everyone laughed hysterically, patted each other's knees, and wiped away tears. He even saw his parents among them, including his father. He was alive. How was that possible? What was happening? It turns out that they had all planned a big prank on Billy to get revenge on him for not keeping in touch. His wife was also involved. She had always encouraged him to visit his old friends and talk to his parents. Eventually, Billy was able to laugh about it too, and did his best to re-establish his past relationships. Later, he even moved to his hometown, so he could spend more time with his former friends and family.